Velarization is a process in which the velum is involved. Velum is basically the soft palate, right? Just behind palate. So that soft palate, which is called velum, when that is involved in the production of some sounds, then that process is called velarization. Velarization is an important secondary articulation in English. So we need to explain what is velarization and how it is articulated, and then what is meant by the process of velarization, right? So velarization is a secondary articulation in a process through which something from the velum is added to the primary articulation of a sound, right? Primary articulation, when what is the actual place of articulation, but in addition to that actual place of articulation, something more is added from velum, right? So that is called velarization, right? Um, this is secondary articulation. And why do we call it secondary articulation? Because the secondary articulation is basically a narrow one. That's the little one, the smaller one. And the actual articulation is the primary one. So it's a mixture of two articulation. One is the primary articulation, as the second is the secondary articulation. Primary articulation, remember that that's the actual place of articulation in the articulation of the sound. And secondary articulation is something which is done in addition to what is taking place, right? So that's the secondary articulation which is placed. So velarization is the secondary articulation, a good example of secondary articulation. And it is done in some cases, as an example, when the l, for example, when the l is taking place at the end of a word, right? So that would become, a velarized, right? A velarized l, right? Like in word like fill, right? Or trill. So the l sound, which is taking place at the end, that has become, velarized. And this is also called the dark l, right? Interestingly, that's an important phenomenon in English phonology, basically. That is named as dark l, right? And what is happening basically is that the alveolar sound, it is just made like something like O, right? Because alveolar, which is just behind your upper teeth, alveolar ridge, l is supposed to be produced from that alveolar ridge, but then it is produced from a little big part of the cavity. So that's why the l sound has become this velarized l, right? And it is realized in transcription through the small, mark of tilde, this tilde sound, tilde mark basically, and it is marked through the segment, like through the, the symbol, right? And there is one more mark which is used for velarization, and it is this la sound in, in Urdu, the Urdu la basically, but very small. It's like a diacritic. These two are diacritics basically. So these are the markers which are used for the realization of velarization. And there are examples. So just compare two words, live and file. So l in life is, you can call it a clear l or maybe a complete l, right? In life, because it is taking place, the onset position in this syllable, life, l, I, and f, life, right? But in another word like file, because f, I, and l, so the l which is occurring at the end, at the coda position, that l is the dark l, and that's a velarized l. You can just analyze the difference by just analyzing what is taking place into your cavity, like live, right? So if you try to pronounce it slowly, like live, right? And then file, file. So this is not the l which is similar to the l in live, right? And that's a difference through which we can understand this process of velarization, right? And there is one more example, like clap and then talc, right? So in clap, the l is different than talc, the l in talc, right? And it is, you can see on this transcription that the l is just marked as velarized because there is a tilde through it given in the mid of the l, right? So that is the velarization mark. And something more about Wheelerization, because it's very common in Arabic. In Arabic, there is, the phenomenon of Wheelerization, which is very common. Like you might have heard to these kutubu jaddun, right? Kutubu jaddun. So if you just realize that what is taking place at these five sounds, so they are made a little bit of Wheelerized nature. And then it's an important point for the students of phonetics and phonology, not only to understand, but also to describe it. And there is a description which I'm giving here to you. Like this is the clear L. The clear L, it is produced from alveolar ridge. Yeah, is already discussed, but I'm now showing through this figure. So this is the alveolar ridge from where the clear L is pronounced in words like life. Okay, life. So this L is here. This is clear L, right? And then here you see the alveolar ridges touch, because that's the actual place of articulation. That's the primary place of articulation or primary articulation, right? But in addition to that primary articulation, something more is actually taking place here, because this is the soft palate or the velum. So that is actually what is happening here is that the back of the tongue is raised towards the soft palate, right? Velum, right? And that's why this Wheelerization is taking place. So this is primary articulation which is taking place, and this is in addition to the primary articulation. This is the secondary articulation, and this secondary articulation is making the L Wheelerized L, right? In words like, just this file, right? So in file, the L is Wheelerized one. We would transcribe it like this style, okay? So that's the file. And a difference between clear L, a complete L, and then dark L. And the process which is taking place in the making of dark L is called Wheelerization.